suggested, there are many institutions that could have been listed as places where Evans had a major impact in terms of administration. Rather than recruit somebody to speak to each of them, it seemed most apt to ask Martin Millett to talk about John's time at the Society of Antiquaries, where John Evans acted as president. And also Martin, like him, was one of John Evans' students. So I'm looking forward to hearing Martin speak about both the Society and with Evans' future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sara. It's a great privilege to be asked to speak here. As Sara said, I speak as a student of John, one of the early generations of students as an undergraduate at the Institute of Archaeology, where I was privileged to be taught from 1974 to 77, when John Evans was director. And I also speak as a former officer of the Society of Antiquaries and fellow here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Society first. Many of you will know the Society, magnificent apartments and library. The procedure for election to a fellowship of the Society has changed gradually over time, but requires a blue paper to be taken out by the nominators candidate, and thanks to the General Secretary, another student of John's, I've obtained a photocopy of John Davis Evans MA's certificate for candidate for election, which was taken out on the 26th of October 1954, was read to an audience in this room on the 3rd of March 1955, and was balloted successfully for election on the 5th of May 1955. So I'll read it for the second time in this room. John Davis Evans, MA, Fellow of Pembroke College, Cambridge, Residence, Pembroke College, Cambridge, Qualification, Research Fellow in Archaeology, Pembroke College, Cambridge, have done field work and excavation in Spain, Turkey, Greece, Sicily, and Malta, author of the prehistoric cultural sequences of the Maltese archipelago, etc. Proposed from personal knowledge by Glyn Daniel, Stuart Piggott, Miles Burkitt, Geoffrey Bushnell, J.C. Dickinson, John Wood Perkins, and contravention of the statutes, Miles Burkitt, for the second time. Thanks to Adrian in the library for helping us disentangle the signatures. Glyn Daniel, Stuart Piggott, known to everyone, senior figures, Cambridge and Edinburgh at the time, as was Charles Burney, the young Graham Clark, upcoming, from whom I see photographed outside, that John dug with at Star Car, Miles Burkitt, also from the department in Cambridge, Geoffrey Bushnell, South American archaeologist who was the curator of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge. The Reverend J.C. Dickinson was the chaplain of Pembroke and a specialist, I believe, on Gothic architecture. And John Wood Perkins, director for a long time of British Rome, with whom presumably John had direct dealings in his work in Malta. That election in 1955, which was a good year, the year I was born, was followed by 56 years as a fellow of the Society and some extraordinary service to the Society. He was elected director in 1975, serving till 1980. The role of director of the Society, which I held for a while, is one that is shrouded in mystery. No one really quite knows what it means. It's an 18th century office, And today it generally involves involvement with the Society's research and publications, and in the current organisation, the Director chairs those committees. And one learns from reading the annual reports from that period that arrangement dealing with the Research Committee, the Publications Committee, was an arrangement that was sorted out under John Evans's directorship. And so we owe the organisation that to him. And in chairing the Research Committee, the Director has a certain amount of influence over the way in which research funds are spent. And this interest in the research, which covers an enormous range, is reflected in John's generous benefaction to the Society in his will of money for prehistoric research. On a personal note, it's also very interesting the way in which, as I should say later, John clearly helped his many students in a variety of different ways in the earlier parts of their careers. And one can detect, looking through the research grants of that period, how he was able to offer, the Society through him was able to offer research support for a very large number of younger scholars in that period. One of those quiet ways in which he changed the subject. Speaking for myself, I received my first research grant from the Society in 1978 during the period of his directorship. He then stood down as director, as he'd given notice that he wouldn't be able to serve all that long because of the other duties that John Wilkes has described for us, but returned as an officer as the president of the Society between 1984 and 1987. This we can all see was not an easy period for him to have been president of this Society. It's the period David Harris has talked about when the negotiations are going on for bringing the Institute into UCL, and it is the period that John Wilkes has alluded to, the controversy surrounding the World Archaeology Congress. But what we see, and I urge you to go and read John's presidential addresses, is the way in which he embodied the values of the Society of Antiquaries, a society which sees the broad spectrum from prehistoric archaeology to the latest archaeology, to buildings, to seals, to architecture, to art history, all brought together with a common interest in the material past. And his presidential addresses emphasise the continuing vibrancy of the Society in that period. Interestingly, speaking of the tension between tradition and change within society that the current president will no doubt recognise as a continuing issue, and emphasising the importance of it being a broad society where people come and hear lectures on a wide range of things, not simply focusing on their own narrow interests, and emphasising the importance of fellowship in that common endeavour. I can't resist, though, pointing out some of the other things that happened during John's presidency. He was president in the period of the very major investment in the Sutton Hoo excavations, which is one of the very important campaigns of work that the Society backed during the second half of the 20th century. He was also responsible for the appointment as librarian of Bernard Nurse, who served until only a few years ago and was a regular attender meetings here, and was also president and must have taken very close interest, reading from the presidential address, in the process of computerising the library catalogue, which is something that has had an enormous impact on the use and the nature of the library ever since. So even in those difficult periods, John was a quiet reformer and someone who, in the full traditions of the society, pushed the subject and pushed the institution forward. If I can finish, though, by turning to my experience as a student at the Institute of Archaeology and reminiscing about John as director. I was there from 74 to 77. We were in the relatively early years of the undergraduate degrees. There were 16 people in our year. There were more staff than there were students in the year. Not a thing that you can deal with staff-student ratios like that very often. It was a very informal place, and I always think of John as sitting in his office just inside the door of the Institute with his secretary, was Marjorie, wasn't it? Sitting there. The door commonly open, so that if he didn't bump into you in the basement tea room, you sometimes called in to his office. It was an open, friendly, and supportive atmosphere. John, I'm sure, knew all his students. He seemed to know us all by name and knew what we were doing. He was immensely supportive, and the Institute in those days was committed to field work. We were all committed to field work. We were required to do, I think, 12 weeks to receive our degree. He was immensely encouraging of individual initiative in a quiet way, and did an enormous amount just to not direct students, but to enable students. And his door was always open. I remember particularly going to see him as one of the officers of the University of London Archaeological Society to ask whether we could hold a conference in the Institute in 1977, which was the conference that called Pottery and the Archaeologist. Not only did he support us, he came and gave the opening address, talking about his work on not only the pottery that Ken talked about in Knossos, but also some amusing stories about Flinders Petrie's uses of pottery in Egypt. I can do no more, I think, than conclude by quoting from A.R. Dufty's presidential address in 1980, marking John's retirement from the directorship of the Antiquaries. He simply says, "His kindly way, no less his wisdom, have charmed and helped the society." And one would add, inter alia, his former students too.